Hey guys, recently I reviewed the original Nosferatu from 1922. Now, Nosferatu was a silent horror film directed by F.W. Murnau and was loosely based on the novel Dracula by Bram Stoker, and it was the oldest surviving adaptation of Dracula. I'm following that review up with a review of Werner Herzog's 1979 remake of Nosferatu, Nosferatu the Vampyre, and I'm joined by my friend Jeremy. Now, I'm pronouncing it Werner because apparently in Germany the W is said with a V sound. I could be completely wrong on that, but that's what I've heard, and I've heard it pronounced as Werner instead of Warner. However, don't be surprised throughout this video if I accidentally call him Werner Herzog. Herzog also directed movies like Aguirre, The Wrath of God, Fitzcarraldo, and he would go on to direct films like Rescue Dawn and Bad Lieutenant, Port of Call, New Orleans. He also directed several acclaimed documentaries. Now, Jeremy, what do you think of the 1979 version of Nosferatu, and how do you think it compares to the original?
I think it's a very good movie. It's a very haunting movie. I think it holds up well when put against the original. I think it's a worthy remake.
Yeah, I do want to point out that 79 was actually a relatively big year for Dracula movies. The same year as this, you had the Frank Langella Dracula film, and you had the porno film Dracula Sucks. You also had the Stephen King adaptation Salem's Lot, and of course Salem's Lot is basically Stephen King's version of Dracula, so 79 was kind of the year of Dracula, it seems like.
Yeah, I guess so.
I really liked this movie. I had not seen the movie until recently. I watched it in preparation for this review. Back when Blockbusters were still around, I remember seeing a copy of the movie at Blockbuster all the time, but for some reason I never rented it. And I think the movie really does capture the eerie, dreamlike quality and atmosphere of the original film. At the same time, I think the film definitely has sort of a voice of its own.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Werner Herzog he's such a great director. He just, how do I put this? He frames his shots so beautifully, and they're just a marvel to look at. He also combines that with this very haunting score that is just, it gave me chills, for lack of a better term.
Now, I do think it's interesting how with the original Nosferatu, they changed the names of several characters from the book. For example, the vampire, instead of being called Count Dracula, was called Count Orlok. However, in this remake, they call him Dracula, which, yes, he is Dracula. The character is based on Dracula from the novel. I think it's interesting that so many people know this particular version of Dracula as Count Orlok. I think it's interesting how Herzog decided to call him Dracula instead of Orlok in this one.
Yeah, that's because at that time, or somewhere around that time, the novel Dracula fell into the public domain, so he said, you know what, I might as well just put the original names back.
So the plot of Nosferatu the Vampyre is it's set in 19th century Germany, and it follows a real estate agent named Jonathan Harker who is sent by his boss to Transylvania to see a count named Dracula who wishes to buy property in Harker's home city. When he gets to Transylvania, he tells some local gypsies that he's going to see Dracula, and they all warn him to stay away from the castle. When Harker gets to the castle, he learns that his client is a demonic vampire who holds him captive, and eventually the vampire travels to Harker's home city to spread a devastating plague and prey on Harker's wife Lucy. Now, in the film, Klaus Kinski plays Count Dracula. Now, Kinski actually does have sort of a Dracula connection that predates this, because he actually played Renfield in the Jess Franco Dracula film. Now, Kinski has also worked with Werner Herzog many times before, despite the fact that they apparently hated each other. Now, it's fitting that Kinski plays such a creepy version of Dracula in this movie, because by all accounts, Kinski in real life was a genuinely creepy and genuinely awful human being from everything I've heard. What do you think of Kinski's Dracula in this?
I think Klaus Kinski does a fantastic job playing this monstrous fiend. Kind of like Klaus Kinski in real life. First of all, the makeup job on him is just perfect. They do the original look justice, I think, and it looks great in color too. He's got the pointy ears, he's got the long nails, he's got the two teeth in the front. It's a great look for his version of the vampire. And he also he had that very eerie voice, and he sort of had a bit of a soft way of speaking, and yet it was menacing at the same time. And also I noticed in the way he moves in a lot of scenes, itself is just very creepy. Like, there's that scene in the castle between him and Jonathan when Jonathan is cutting the bread and he accidentally cuts his finger, and Count Dracula sees the blood. You can tell in his performance that he's trying desperately to restrain himself, but he just can't. And when he gives into it, it's like this force is just bursting out. He lunges at him. He tries to suck it hard. It's almost like he's got a wild animal inside him, for lack of a better term.
I think Kinski also brings almost a sad, melancholy aspect to his Dracula, because you almost get the sense that Dracula in this movie genuinely doesn't want to be doing what he's doing, but his nature sort of compels him to do what he's doing.
Yeah, he even says at one point, I'm paraphrasing here, but it's horrible to not grow old and to just constantly live the same futility over and over again, live for centuries. Yeah, it's a great performance, and it's a very, at one point he is, as you said, somewhat melancholy, and in another moment he's very frightening and vicious. And I think Kinski does a great job at playing both.
Kinski, there's no doubt that he was a great actor, but he was also a bad fucking dude. Like, by all accounts, he was abusive towards almost every director he worked with, and I know he was, abusive to other actors as well.
Very.
Also, one of Kinski's two daughters, Paula, I think is her name, came out and said that Kinski did sexually abuse her, and while Natasha Kinski, I believe, said that she doesn't necessarily remember any physical abuse, it's widely believed that Kinski might have also abused her as well. If there's a hell, I'm pretty sure this guy's in hell.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, he was a dangerously insane human being. I heard a story about, I think it was a movie called Venom he was in, about a killer snake or something. And I think the director was, directing him on how to, pretend to strangle someone. And the Klaus Kinski, he kind of said, "Oh, you mean like this?" And then he actually tried to strangle the director for real. And it's like, Jesus, what the fuck was wrong with this guy?
Later on, he was in a horror film called Crawl Space, and apparently the director of the movie did a short documentary about his experiences working with Kinski called Please Kill Mr. Kinski, and according to that documentary, the casting crew of that movie Crawl Space legitimately wanted him to arrange an accident to kill Klaus Kinski.
Oh yeah, Werner Herzog, He made a documentary in 1999 about his volatile working relationship with Klaus Kinski called My Best Fiend. And I haven't seen it yet, but I really do want to see it because, I actually got to tell Mr. Werner Herzog himself that the relationship between him and Klaus Kinski has always fascinated me very much. It's one of those director-actor relationships that's just, like I said, fascinating. I think Werner Herzog respected him as an actor, but as a man, he knew that he was a madman, and yet he used him for his acting ability. It's like he knew he was dangerous, but he just couldn't stop hiring him.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, if I were a director and Klaus Kinski were still alive, I don't care how good of an actor he is. I would never work with him. I respect my sanity too much to work with somebody like him.
Oh, neither would I. Yeah, he was a very frightening person in real life. It's interesting that we're talking about this because I remember I watched this old interview with him on YouTube where he actually was on The Late Show with David Letterman, and surprisingly, he was very restrained, and he actually even seemed polite.
Maybe he was sedated.
He was a lunatic, and yet I'm fascinated by him. You know, the fact that he was even able to have a career despite how insane he was, it's just, for lack of a better term, it is quite something to behold. As far as this film is concerned, he is very good in the role. I admire, like I said, his look. You know, the makeup artist, I believe, she did a very good job on him. And surprisingly, despite his horrific nature, I read that he was actually very patient in the makeup chair, because the makeup, according to IMDb, it took 4 hours, although he said in an interview that it took 5. His ears, the pointy ears, they had to constantly make a new set of them every day, because when they'd remove them at the end of the filming day, they would be destroyed. So it was a very tedious process, but it definitely, the look of his Count Dracula just came out beautifully.
In the film, Isabelle Adjani plays the character of Lucy, who is based on the character of Mina from the novel. Lucy is actually the name of a completely different character in the novel, and what's interesting is there is a character in this movie who is sort of a stand-in for the character of Lucy, but that character is actually called Mina. It's similar to what they did with Horror of Dracula. Horror of Dracula did the same thing. They basically just switched those two characters' names around, but Isabelle Adjani does an amazing job in this movie as Lucy. And I also think Lucy, or Mina, is actually a lot more proactive in this version of the story than she was in the original Nosferatu. You definitely get a sense that she already had sort of an awareness of the supernatural even prior to Dracula coming into her life. Again, she does a great job, and I also gotta say, Isabelle Adjani is fucking scary hot in this movie. But what do you think of her in this film?
Oh, I think she does a great job. She portrays Lucy's fearfulness very well. Well, she conveys that she's genuinely afraid for Jonathan, and she makes you feel her terror, if that makes any sense. I like that this version of Lucy also kind of takes matters into her own hands and finds her strength to defeat Count Dracula. I thought that was very good. Bruno
Ganz, if I'm saying his name right, plays Jonathan Harker. What do you think of him in this movie?
I think he did a great job too. I think the whole cast is great.
What do you think of the twist at the end where he basically, it kind of implies at the end that he's going to be the new Dracula. That's kind of what the implication is at the end of the film, and I was actually not expecting that.
It's a pretty tragic twist, but I always said that a remake should do some things differently, and that was pretty different.
Also in the film, you have Roland Topor. Is that how you say his last name?
I believe so, but I'm not 100% sure.
In the movie, he plays Renfield, and does a pretty good job, I think. What do you think of Renfield?
Oh, he is great. He is totally insane. And I want to point out that I've seen both the German-speaking version of this movie and the English-speaking version of it. And his maniacal laugh when he's insane is definitely more pronounced and more obvious in the English-speaking version. I mean, that laugh is just perfectly crazy.
And what do you think of Walter Ladengast? Is that how you say his name? As Van Helsing?
I think it's Ladengast, but I'm not sure about that. But yeah, he did a great job too.
The one thing about Van Helsing in this movie is this is one of the few Dracula movies where Van Helsing really doesn't do shit. At least towards the end he does.
Yeah, he also doesn't even believe Lucy at first when she tells him he's a vampire and we have to put a stop to this evil, and he just thinks it's all superstition. You know, in other versions, he's like the driving force to vanquish Dracula. Here, he really doesn't get Lucy as the driving force to vanquishing Dracula here. He doesn't really do anything until the very end.
Now, I gotta mention, the cinematography in this movie is absolutely gorgeous. Who's the cinematographer for this? Do you know?
Georg Schmidt-Reitwein.
Once again, like, he did an amazing job with the camera work in this movie.
Oh, yeah. The shots, a lot of them look so beautiful, especially when you see the landscape and the ocean. They're just the sights of them are just breathtaking.
I think I mentioned before, this film has such an eerie, almost dreamlike quality, much like the original film does. And also, one thing I really love about this film, and it's something that the original film did as well, in this version of the Dracula story, Dracula really does feel like the living personification of a plague. Like, he feels like a disease personified. And especially in this one, the plague that he brings to the city is almost apocalyptic. Like, in this film, you almost get a sense that Dracula is one of the horsemen of the apocalypse. And one of the creepiest scenes in this movie to me is the scene where the city is just completely decimated by the plague, and you see all these people dancing in the town square. Like, there's just something really genuinely chilling and haunting about that scene.
Oh yeah, it's pretty horrifying, alright. I mean, Dracula, he also sends all those rats. He brings all these rats with him to Wismar. Those rats, I'm sure, are loaded with disease, and they're the ones mainly spreading it around. Speaking of the rats, Werner Herzog actually stated that the rats were more well-behaved on the set than Klaus Kinski was.
You mentioned to me that the film has had accusations of animal cruelty.
The traveling conditions were so poor that the rats had started to eat each other upon their arrival in the Netherlands, and they had to be dyed gray. They were white, but had to be dyed gray. And in order to do that, they had to submerge them in cages in boiling water for several seconds, which caused another half of them to die. And that proved to be pointless anyway, because the surviving rats would proceed to lick themselves clean of the dye immediately. For both this movie and also the original Nosferatu, I do like how the vampire has taken on kind of a rat-like appearance. I mean, maybe that's why he decides to use rats, because they're like him. I mean, that's just a theory, of course.
So, want to talk more about your experience meeting Werner Herzog?
Oh, sure, yeah, it's my pleasure. I met him, let's see, it was, I think, back in June or July of this year, and it was at the IFC Center in New York City, and it was at a screening of Aguirre, The Wrath of God, and, you know, he was just great to listen to. You know, I remember him specifically saying about Aguirre, The Wrath of God, you know, I had a madman on my set. I brought with me the insert of my Blu-ray of Aguirre, The Wrath of God. You know, I wanted him to sign it, but one of the theater employees said, you know, he's really just signing the book, so let's respect the artist's wishes. And at first I thought, oh, okay, there's no chance. But then, you know, as I'm sitting waiting, I see other people in line getting other stuff signed, and from what I saw, he didn't seem to have a problem with it. So I said, you know what, I'll show it to him. The worst he can do is say no. And I got up to meet him, and I got to tell him that I really enjoyed the movie, and that I'm always fascinated by his working relationship with Klaus Kinski, and he was very nice. I had attached this Blu-ray insert to a piece of cardboard so he could lean on it, and I put it down on the table, and without me even saying anything, after he signed my copy of his book, he took the insert, and he signed it. Again, he was very engaging, you know, just talking about The Making of Aguirre, The Wrath of God. If I can, I'd love to meet him again. Brilliant director.
Now, I want to point out that there was actually a novelization of this film released, I think, the same year. Our friend Bill actually gave me the novelization. I don't know what the author's name was off the top of my head, but it's kind of interesting that they did a novelization of this, considering it's already based on a book. So I always found that to be kind of redundant when they do novelizations of movies that were already based on books to begin with. I mean, I guess since this is such a different interpretation of the Dracula story, the point of novelizations at the time were so people could re-experience a film, so I guess doing a novelization makes sense. There was also a sort of semi-sequel to this released in 1988 called Nosferatu in Venice, also known as Vampire in Venice. Now, I forgot to mention in my review of the original Nosferatu, but currently there are two separate Nosferatu remakes in production. One has apparently been in production for several years, so who knows when this is going to be released, but there's one that has Doug Jones playing Count Orlok. And then there's also another remake that is going to be made, directed by Robert Eggers and starring Bill Skarsgård as Count Orlok. Now, I'm a pretty big Robert Eggers fan based on his three movies, The Witch, The Lighthouse, and The Northman, so I'm really excited to see how he tackles this story. Nosferatu in Venice is going to be my next movie review. I don't know if Jeremy is going to be able to join me for that or not.
Well, I've already watched most of the movies, so chances are I probably will be a part of the review.
Alright, so stay tuned for that review, and bye.